Standard Deviant School.
Welcome to Standard Deviant School, American Government. I'm Christiana Knight. Our program today is the judicial system. We've all heard about the Supreme Court, right? But do you really know what goes on in those hallowed halls? How do the justices decide their cases? How do they get on the bench?
Hey guys, here's what we're going to cover today. First, a little history. Then we'll introduce you to each level of the judicial branch: the federal district courts, the circuit courts, and the Supreme Court. And we'll describe the roles of each. Then we'll find out how justices are selected, how cases make their way through the courts, and give you some insight on how the justices decide their cases. Let's get started.
Woodrow Wilson said some 100 years ago that the Supreme Court is the balance beam of the whole constitutional system. Yet, some 100 years before that, in 1787, Alexander Hamilton called the judicial branch the least dangerous branch of the United States government.
Well, how can this branch go from being virtually powerless to being one of the most influential within the constitutional system? Taking a look at the creation of this branch might help us understand why.
Article 3 of the Constitution gave America its judicial branch when it said,
"The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish." Which means, hey everybody, how's about a government branch that interprets our laws?
When this part of the Constitution was first written, not all citizens agreed to this court system. There were two main schools of thought, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist. He and all his Federalist buddies saw the new Supreme Court as the least harmful branch in the government. But the Anti-Federalists weren't so blasé about the whole thing. The Anti-Federalists felt that a branch of government made up of people with a lifelong tenure was dangerous, especially since they had the power to interpret the meaning and importance of the supreme law of the land. Supreme Court justices would be justices until they died or stepped down from office according to the Constitution.
well, the Anti-Federalists did have a point. Article 3 was a bit vague when it came to the structure of the Supreme Court. That's why, in 1789, the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed.
The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the three-tier structure of the federal court system. Those three tiers include the federal district courts, the circuit courts, and the Supreme Court.
Before we get any deeper into the world of the judicial system, you should know a quirk of the American legal system.
Specifically, the American legal system has made several names for itself. The first name is the dual system. You see, while there are all those federal courts and the courts of appeal and the Supreme Court, there's also another arena for law in this country, and this is thanks to the dual system.
The dual system consists of the federal court system we just outlined and the individual judicial systems at the state level.
Secondly, known as the three-tiered system, the American judicial system contains three different levels of courts within both the federal and state levels. Each tier has a different jurisdiction.
They are the trial courts, the appeals courts, and the Supreme Court.
Let's see how each of these courts fit together to form the big judicial system.
The federal district courts are the lowest level courts on the federal tier. There are over 94 federal district courts in the country and at least one in each state. What does the authority of the federal district courts include? First, those cases that deal with a federal question whose issue is based on a claim within the U.S. Constitution. Second, cases where the plaintiff or the defendant is the federal government. And third, cases involving diversity of citizenship, meaning cases with people from different states or where the issue involves more than $50,000.
It's in the federal system where most of the big legal work of America occurs. But what happens when the people involved in a case within the federal district courts aren't happy with the outcome? They can move on up to the second tier and take their griping to the circuit courts in the form of an appeal.
The circuit courts, also known as the appeals courts, include 13 courts in the United States. These are courts which have no original jurisdiction.
Now, original jurisdiction refers to a court's authority to hear cases for the first time at the trial level. This is what the federal district courts have.
Instead, the appeals courts have appellate jurisdiction, which refers to the authority to review a case which has already been decided at the trial level. One thing to remember is that the appellate courts determine what laws apply to a case. District courts, on the other hand, determine the facts that decide a case. Appellate court cases are usually heard by a panel of 3 judges with no jury. District courts, on the other hand, are made up of 1 judge, and in the case that a trial is held, a jury of the defendant's peers.
So, getting to the appeals court is like getting another chance in the bull ring. There are 2 types of cases heard at this level: those involving cases from federal district court and those involving issues in federal administrative agencies.
But what happens if after you've made it to the appeals court, you're still not happy with the decision?
You can try your best to take your case to the 3rd tier, the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States includes 9 members, 1 Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. But getting to the Supreme Court is easier said than done. You'd probably have an easier time making it in Hollywood. This is what you've got to do.
First, buy a bus ticket to LA, then knock on all the agents' doors until one of them agrees to see you. Then wow them with your talent and good looks. Oops. Oh, that's how to make it in Hollywood. As far as the Supreme Court is concerned, getting to the Supreme Court involves getting onto the docket. The docket is the list of cases the Supreme Court members have decided to consider.
But getting onto the docket is a battle.
To get onto the Supreme Court docket, you must first submit a brief, which is a document containing the collected legal arguments of your case, and you must include precedents. Precedents are prior judicial decisions that help support your side of the argument.
Parties must wait a long time before their case gets considered for the docket, unless it's an emergency of some sort.
And even after that long wait, chances are the court will end up making the decision of stare decisis.
In Latin, stare decisis means let the decision stand. When a decision stands, the case does not get onto the docket, and it does not get heard in the Supreme Court. The ruling made in the lower court will stand.
If the Supreme Court justices accept your brief, they grant you what is called certiorari. Although it sounds like a monster Godzilla would fight, it's actually a review of the case. Being granted certiorari means that you are now on the docket. Getting this far is pretty impressive in and of itself, even if the court doesn't overturn the case in the end.
4 of the 9 justices must agree to accept a case before they grant a writ of certiorari. If the case gets to the Supreme Court, it may have a chance to shape history.
Remember earlier we mentioned the Supreme Court was once seen as ineffective, meaning it rarely overturned cases? Well, it wasn't until Chief Justice Marshall's court, which lasted from 1801 to 1835, that real authority was placed in the hands of the justices in form of judicial review.
Judicial review is the power of the courts to review the decisions of another department or level of government. The court can interpret the constitutionality of the decisions and subsequent actions.
The court did not get this power from the Constitution. Instead, it just claimed it for their own during the case of Marbury versus Madison, 1803.
Judicial review allows the Supreme Court to decide all final arbitrary questions regarding the U.S. Constitution.
Since Marbury versus Madison, the judicial branch has, at times, determined whether the actions of the President, the Congress, the American bureaucratic system, and the states themselves are indeed constitutional.
Of course, while the judicial branch has the interpretive checking power called judicial review, the other branches have checking authority over the judicial branch.
First, Congress has the power to change the jurisdiction of the federal courts, or decide what kinds of cases the courts can consider. Second, Congress can also pass constitutional amendments that, if ratified, can alter court decisions. Third, Congress can impeach and remove federal judges. And fourth, the President is the person who nominates the Supreme Court justices, with the Senate having the final confirmation vote.
You can be sure that the President is not likely to nominate a potential Supreme Court justice he doesn't agree with policy-wise. That's because policy-making plays a big role in the world of the Supreme Court. Remember, the court can rule over a vast amount of important policy topics, including commerce, civil rights, and civil liberties. This is the stuff that policy is made of.
The first interesting aspect of Supreme Court selection is that unlike Congress and the presidency, justices are appointed and not voted in by America. And the requirements for these potential judges don't include the kinds of necessary characteristics as those of senators and such.
The Constitution does not determine whether a judge needs to be a certain age or have a certain citizenship standing. In fact, the real requirements for Supreme Court nominees are much more vague and political. In fact, you don't even have to be a lawyer.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what it takes to be nominated for a seat in the federal court system, including the Supreme Court, let's look at the nomination process itself.
The president is traditionally the one who nominates a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice, or he or she may accept the recommendation of a senator. This is called senatorial courtesy. Senatorial courtesy is more often associated with the nomination of appellate or district court judge nominees. The president tends to pick potential Supreme Court justice nominees. It's an extremely important political decision most presidents want control over. In the end, the president must make the final official on-the-books nomination.
Aside from the personal opinions and desires of the president or senators, there are other criteria for nominations affecting who becomes a viable player in the federal judicial system. Take a look at the following criteria senators and presidents consider when choosing judicial nominees.
First, many consider the competence and ethical standards of judicial nominees. Those considered for judicial positions are expected to have at least some judicial experience. Second, ideological and policy preferences tend to come into play, meaning presidents and senators tend to favor possible nominees who share their ideology and opinions on policy. Third, the reward factor may affect the nominations. This is when presidents end up picking their close friends or political allies. Fourth, influence of possible political power can affect nominations. Presidents tend to choose a nominee who wants to increase the executive branch's powers rather than chip it away. Fifth, to better represent America as a whole, there's been a push towards diversity. An increased desire for diversity in the court system's main players, the justices, is also apparent in public opinion.
With that handful of factors to consider, after the president makes a nomination, the Senate then goes off and begins the process of confirmation. Several things take place during the confirmation process. First, there are lots of investigations by the FBI, the Senate Judiciary Committee, interest groups, and organizations such as the American Bar Association. These investigations bring out into the open the past experiences and the political standings of the judicial nominees.
Now, these investigations are an important aspect of the confirmation process, as they scrutinize the background of the nominee. At the same time that these investigations take place, other exciting things are also keeping the senators and the news media busy, including lobbying by interest groups.
Groups that may have a stake in upcoming cases or big issues tend to get involved in the political arena at the time of federal and Supreme Court confirmations, at the time of the president's nomination announcements, or even earlier if they want to support potential nominees.
For instance, if there's a big civil rights issue looming on the Supreme Court's docket and an open seat on the court, chances are several civil rights groups will speak up. They will voice their support or opposition of that nominee, depending upon the nominee's political views and how they fit with those of various interest groups.
After all the investigation and lobbying, then comes the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings.
Senate committee hearings are when the Senate gets to ask the nominee why he or she would make a good federal judge.
Well, actually, they can pretty much ask for anything from the nominee until all the senators feel like they have enough information to vote. If they want to, they can ask other people questions besides the nominee, like friends, colleagues, enemies, and pets.
After the Senate hearing comes the Senate vote for whether to seat or boot the nominee. Typically, the results of these votes have reflected the opinions of the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is the committee that questions and investigates the nominees.
Once the vote is made, the new justice takes a walk down the runway and is crowned Justice for Life.
So now you know who gets to call this building their office. But what do these justices do after they've had a high-fiber diet in the morning?
The Supreme Court justices have a load of responsibilities to juggle each and every day. We'll look at these heavy chores now.
The main job of the Supreme Court justices involves determining whether a case makes it to the court, listening to oral arguments, and interpreting the laws behind these cases.
There are about 7,000 cases each year that petition the court to be heard. That's right, 7,000. But the Supreme Court only hears maybe 150 cases a year, and that's still a lot. Stop it, you're hogging my scene.
The Supreme Court hears cases from October till late June or early July of each year. This time is called the Supreme Court's term. The term is divided into 2-week periods when the court is either sitting or recessed. When the court is sitting, it hears cases and delivers opinions. They can hear up to 24 cases in just one sitting. When the court is recessed, the justices work on their opinions and study upcoming cases.
Remember, we already told you how a case makes it to the Supreme Court. It must first be considered in the trial and appellate courts. Then, if there is still a difference of opinion, one of the parties can take the case to the Supreme Court in the form of a brief. If they are lucky, a writ of certiorari is granted, which means the case makes it to the court's docket. But you should already know that, wink wink. However, you may be wondering what factors keep a case from getting onto the docket.
Politics are a big factor. If the Supreme Court thinks a case is too political, which means they think it would be better handled in Congress by the passage or amendment of laws, then the 9 justices will stay away from it. The other reason justices may decide a case does not merit Supreme Court consideration is if, in their opinion, the case is already clearly decided or not worthy enough to be heard in the highest court of the land. Due to the volume of cases trying to get onto the Supreme Court docket, the justices must restrict the cases they hear to those that will have a substantial impact on the nation.
So, if politics and banality don't get in the way, you're on the docket, which means you need to be preparing for oral arguments.
Oral arguments are when each side of the case has a half hour to argue their side of the case while the Supreme Court justices ask the lawyers any questions they want about issues behind the case.
Just a half hour? Well, this may sound like it's not a lot of time, but remember, the justices have already read extensive written arguments.
After these arguments, if the justices still aren't satisfied that they have enough information, they schedule a re-argument. Otherwise, the case moves forward via the conference.
The conference is when the justices get together in secret and talk amongst themselves about the case. The speaking goes in order of seniority. The Chief Justice presides over these discussions and presents each case first.
Eventually, they all stop talking and exchanging memos and start voting. The majority vote wins. The majority vote must be at least 5-4 when the court is full. After the vote comes the writing of the opinion.
The writing of the opinion is when the majority side of the vote puts its opinion down on paper. This is called the majority opinion. If the Chief Justice is part of the majority, he or she decides who writes the opinion. Otherwise, the senior member of the majority decides.
The opinion must be drafted, then agreed to by each individual member of the majority. There are also a few different kinds of opinions that can be written.
A concurring opinion is an opinion written by a member of the majority decision that disagrees with the reasoning. A dissenting opinion is an opinion which disagrees with the majority and discusses the minority opinion.
But why justices vote one way or another is the heart of the judicial branch. Several legal and extra-legal factors can influence a Supreme Court justice's voting patterns. Legal factors include judicial philosophies and precedents.
Judicial philosophy is made up of 2 dueling viewpoints, judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial activism is belief that judges should use their powers to influence and further justice and policy, while judicial restraint, also known as strict constructionism, asserts that as non-elected officials, judges should stay away from trying to make new policies.
Outside of judicial philosophies, the other legal influence on Supreme Court rulings is precedent. Precedent is using prior decisions to determine the outcome of a current case.
We also said extra legal factors also influence the justices' decisions. The important extra legal factors for you to know and conquer are behavioral characteristics, ideology, attitudinal model, and public opinion.
Behavioral characteristics refer to the individual social backgrounds of the justices and how they affect their personal opinions of issues. These background characteristics include race, sex, religion, socioeconomic background, and more. Ideology is the part of the political spectrum that individual justices will fall in. Like, is the justice conservative or liberal? These personal opinions will influence how they will vote on issues, especially those involving federalism. Attitudinal model refers to how justices may decide cases based on their own personal preference for public policy. They're human, right? And all of us have our own ideas on what's right and what's wrong. So do Supreme Court justices. Lastly, public opinion is sure to have a great influence on the Supreme Court's voting patterns. What the people think does matter, and the justices get plenty of that from the briefs, the lobbying, and the media. Pleasing the public is actually important to the court, even though they are not elected officials. Without the public's respect and support, the court would lose much of its prestige.
Loss of prestige means loss of power, and along with that, when a court decision results in a need for implementation, it is the public the court must rely on. The people legitimize laws by accepting or denying them.
For example, when the Supreme Court ruled school segregation was unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education, it took much effort before the Southern population finally accepted it.
Time to wrap our program. Belif! Chin chinnery, chin chinnery, chin chin chiroo.
The Judiciary Act of 1789 established a three-tier structure of the federal court system: federal district courts, appeals courts, and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, which lets it decide the constitutionality of decisions made by Congress and the President. But Congress and the President have the power to check the court.
A case makes its way to the Supreme Court by first going through the federal district courts and the appeals courts. If 4 out of 9 justices accept the case, it is granted a writ of certiorari and placed on the docket. After oral arguments, the court discusses and votes on the case and issues an opinion. Lastly, there are both legal and extra-legal factors that influence the Supreme Court justices' votes. And that does it for our look at the judicial system. Now that you're a judicial expert, who knows, maybe one day you'll be on the bench. I'm Christiana Knight. Thanks for watching Standard Deviants School.